expected the woman I married to betray me after years together. 3.5 years into our marriage, I discovered she was having an affair, and I left quietly to reclaim my life. A year later, she found me, desperate to make amends, but I had already begun rebuilding myself. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and moving on. I remember the first time I saw Lila as if it were lit under a single bulb in my mind. Focused, impossible to ignore. It was a neighborhood barbecue 5 years before everything went to hell, and she was leaning against a picnic table, laughing with someone over a ridiculous story about a botched mural. Her laugh was sharp and bright, like glass, and she wore a sundress that caught the sun and made her look like she'd swallowed a little of the afternoon. I wandered over because I wanted to be part of that light. We spoke about nothing important. Music, the nightmare that is assembling flat-pack furniture, a shared disgust for overly sweet latte, and by the time the embers cooled, we had swapped numbers and plans. It's funny how quickly you grant somebody trust when everything else in life hums along. We fell together with the kind of speed that makes friends say, "They looked so right together. We weren't perfect. Who is? But we were electric." Quiet nights slid into loud mornings. Arguments were brief, reparable. Kisses were easy currency. I liked her laugh. I liked her impatience. I liked her hands when she sketched, how they trembled a little at the edges of a line. I told myself that I had lucked into something rare, a partner who loved chaos and order in equal measure, a person who both challenged and comforted me. For 3 years, that was the story. We moved into a roomy flat, saved a down payment with almost ritualistic discipline, and learned the small rhythms of life together. The way she always made coffee with the same careful tilt, how I would leave little post-it notes reminding her of stupid things, how the cat would choose sides in our spats. Our marriage felt more often than not like the right shape for both of us. Then the shape shifted. It didn't snap, it simply bent. Little things began to gather like dust in corners. Late nights that felt routine, phone calls that ended when I walked in, invitations to networking events that stretched into 3 or 4 nights a week. Lila's job demanded a lot. She was ambitious and brilliant. Promotions came fast and often, and with them an ever-receding horizon of sleep. I was traveling too, short contracts that paid well but left me in transit more than at home. And that made arguing about time absurd. We were both doing things we said we wanted. Still, the nights felt thinner. I remember the night that started everything. It was a trivial grocery run. She had asked me to pick up a few things on my way home because I worked nearer the market. Her car was in the driveway when I went outside, its paint warm from the late sun. I opened the rear door to toss in a bag, and something pink winked from under the passenger seat. For a beat I was amused. Okay, surprised, but it wasn't mine. It was delicate, patterned, hers. I knew her taste in intimate clothing the way I knew that she preferred the northeast-facing windows in cafes. I sat on the curb with that bra cupped in my hands, feeling suddenly like a man who'd been given a map with no legend. Why did that small, odd thing slice me? Maybe because intimacy is a private language, and this was a phrase I didn't understand. Maybe because it meant a voice whispered behind my back when all I had was silence. I didn't confront her that night. I kept it in the back of my head like a pressed leaf, something preserved but brittle. I told myself not to read too much into it. I told myself to trust her. Trust, I learned, is patient until it isn't. A month later, in a different variety of betrayal, I found the image on her phone. It wasn't pornographic, it was a snapshot, dim and blurred, of sheets and shoulder. The message that accompanied it said, "Still thinking about last night." My stomach dropped like a stone in cold water, and something in me, practical and animal both, started cataloging evidence. Late taxis, perfume I didn't recognize, a sudden interest in after-work brainstorming sessions that conveniently lasted until sunset. When I confronted Lila, she didn't lie outright. "It's complicated," she said, voice steady but eyes not meeting mine. She spoke of Rowan, suave, bright, someone she met at a design summit who got her in ways she insisted I didn't. She spoke about conversation that opened doors in her, admiration from someone whose work spoke the language she'd been searching for. I listened and felt the floor give. She didn't ask for forgiveness, she asked for understanding. She said he left, or rather, he distanced himself, realizing it couldn't go anywhere, that he'd told her it was a mistake. She cried just enough to seem real. She promised she wanted to try for us again. She wanted to fix it. That half apology, the part that folded around her own pain more than mine, felt like salt. It didn't heal, it didn't even wash, it smeared. I could have erupted. I could have followed her to that anonymous hotel room or rented a private investigator with an ego to match the hurt. Instead, I made a different choice. I packed nothing dramatic. I didn't throw things against walls or shout for neighbors to witness my collapse. I slipped quietly into a bar on the edge of town in a kind of stunned autopilot and let the world blur into noise. That's where I met Ray. He was the sort of man whose face carried the soft, honest lines of a life outside offices. Someone who'd worked with his hands, with a weathered laugh, and the calmness of someone who'd learned not to complicate the obvious. We started talking because grief tends to spill when there's a sympathetic ear, and his was broad and patient. He had a ranch beyond the town, he said. It was nothing fancy, barely a refuge, but a place with trees and space and no expectation. He'd had a trailer on the property that needed better use. "Take it for a bit," he told me, tapping the bar with his glass. Half joking, half sincere. "Hell, I'll even help you set it up. Get away from the city. Clear your head." It was an absurd offer, and yet it hung in the air like a lifeline. There was something about the idea of a flatbed trailer nestled among pines, of waking to air that didn't taste like the inside of a thermostat, that felt like permission to try again. I felt ridiculous agreeing to it, and yet I did. I gave Ray some money for the trailer, not buying, but renting the dignity to leave. And the day I drove away felt like the first page of a life that had been put back into my hands. Leaving wasn't heroic. It was survival. I moved under the open, indifferent sky to a place where the only judge was your own heartbeat. The trailer sat at the edge of a field where the world bent into hills and the sky seemed easier to breathe. I painted the inside a stubborn, bright color, hung sheets over the windows for privacy, and filled the shelves with books I had meant to read someday. The silence there was raw and clean. On the first night, I lay awake listening to the wind stroke the trailer's shutters and thought about how much our lives can hinge on a sequence of tiny decisions. Leela sent me messages, a lot of them, short ones at first. "Where are you? Are you okay?" Then longer strings of contrition that gradually morphed into something pleading. She sounded alternately bewildered and calculated, as if she was testing waters. I ignored most of them. I needed to know I could choose myself. I needed to prove that I wasn't just a convenience she could return to when the fantasy faded. Ray's place became my cocoon. He taught me how to patch a leaky pipe and how the rhythm of mornings could set the tone for a whole day. He introduced me to his neighbor's wife and their dog, and somehow, through small kindnesses, I started to feel human again. I ran the ridge trails when the sun was soft and learned to taste the air the way people sample good coffee, with attention and curiosity. I cooked, I cleaned, I let the cable of the world unwind from me. More importantly, I started to write down things I hadn't been willing to name before. How my voice felt hoarse from swallowing anger, how the idea of being betrayed had a texture like sandpaper, how anger and grief sometimes braided together into something that looked suspiciously like acceptance. But even as I found sanctuary in the hills, there were nights when a different kind of ache came. The memory of how easy it had been to love Leela once, how patient and forgiving I had been in the name of partnership. Those memories arrived like ghosts. I would be pouring coffee and catch myself smiling at a detail only to have it corrode into a bitter thought. I'd watch a couple in town, hands intertwined, and wonder about the chemistry that makes two people forget the promises they once made. And then there were other moments, softer ones, that felt like the first green shoots after a long winter. I met people who weren't interested in the story that had broken me. They were neighbors with dogs and farmers who respected the land, and a woman at the library who recommended Stoic philosophers with the casual compassion of someone used to offering help. These were not the dramatic grand gestures I had once attached meaning to. They were small, practical, generous things that slowly stitched the frayed parts of me back together. In the solitude of the trailer, I thought a lot about identity. Who am I when I'm not someone's husband? Who am I when the script I had been handed, the one that told me how to act and when to be tolerant and how to forgive, falls away? I discovered strange freedoms in answering those questions honestly. I started taking runs for the joy of moving, not to outrun a memory. I started cooking for the pleasure of flavor, not as a performance. I would stand on the trailer's little porch in the mornings and let the world make itself visible in the slow way it does. A rabbit nibbling at the edge of the field, a hawk circling, the sun turning from bruised purple to gold. One evening, a month after I moved out, I found Lila's handwriting on my voicemail. She had called and left a message that had the raw, ragged edges of someone who had been pushed to the bottom of themselves. I made the worst mistake. She said the words without pretense, as if she had been gone and finally understood what she'd traded. She sounded smaller than she had in our laughter-filled beginnings, and for a beat something in me wanted to rush back to be the person who fixed that size, who filled it with comfort and safety. But I remembered that she had once chosen to break the covenant we had built, and healing isn't about erasing the fact that something was broken, it's about building anew on honest ground. There was also the small, insistent way another connection began to form. Gentle, cautious, and honest. Mara, Lila's sister, sent a message asking if I was all right. At first, I hesitated to respond. Too many conversations with family members become battlegrounds for loyalty. But her messages were quiet and consistent, not alarms and not accusations. She asked if I wanted to talk, and I found myself saying yes. Mara and I talked for hours over the next few weeks. At first, our conversations orbited the obvious: weather, books, the small business she ran from home. Later, they dug into deeper soil: childhood memories, what we had each hoped to be, the little disappointments that had taught us who we were. There was no rush. With Mara, I didn't feel interrogated or pitied. I felt listened to. That might seem mundane compared to stolen nights and dramatic confessions, but it mattered. It mattered a lot. I want to be clear, none of this, the trailer, the trips, the new friendships, erased the wound. It did not turn betrayal into a plot hole you could simply skip. It shifted the narrative. It allowed me to move from despair into a space where choices were available again. And choices, I remind myself, are where agency lives. One night, sitting on the porch, I thought about the bra I had found, the image on the phone, the hotel room in the small city, the cascade of small events that had led to this new life. I thought about how bad things can sometimes be the architects of a new future, if we let them. My hands were wrapped around a mug that steamed in the cold air, and I realized that I was finally learning to inhabit the silence without flinching. This was the beginning of something. Not a return to the old, not a curling back into the same shape, but a slow, honest building of a different one. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if reconciliation was possible or desirable. What I knew, with a clarity that felt hard-won, was that I was still standing, and standing for me then was everything. Winter crept in with a quiet insistence. The hillsides turned to muted browns and grays, the kind of color that makes you see the shapes of things more sharply because there's no distraction. Snow dusted the edges of the trailer, and mornings became a matter of scraping frost from windows and coaxing a fire to life. At first, it felt lonely, the way solitude often does when it's new, but it quickly transformed into a companion that spoke in subtle ways. The wind rattling against the siding, the crows circling high above, the way the coffee steamed against the cold, all became part of a rhythm I could inhabit, one that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I started waking earlier, the body remembering the muscle memory of running over uneven terrain, of climbing ridges with air so thin it hurt the lungs. The world felt bigger than the city I had left, and yet smaller in its simplicity. I learned the names of trees, the tracks of foxes, and the way a hawk's shadow moves across a snow-covered field. Each observation was a stitch in the new life I was weaving, a life that didn't require me to justify my feelings or actions to anyone. Mara's presence lingered in the background like a soft chord. We would talk late into the evening over video calls, sharing mundane details about the day. She had a cat, I had my little stove, but slowly the conversations deepened. She would ask about my mornings, my routines, and eventually my fears, my regrets. She never judged, never pushed. There was no rush, no unspoken expectation of emotional debt. I found myself looking forward to these calls in a way that surprised me. The sound of her voice was not a replacement for what I had lost, but it was a balm I hadn't realized I needed. By January, the trailer felt more like a home than a temporary shelter. I had hung curtains, laid down rugs, and even built a small bookshelf out of reclaimed wood. It was crude and uneven, but it carried a sense of permanence. Each night, after the fire dwindled to embers, I would sit with my notebook and write. Not for publication, not for anyone to read, but to map the territory of my mind, to confront the emotions that had been left tangled and unresolved. Betrayal, anger, grief, and eventually threads of hope, all spilled onto the page. Writing became a ritual, a way to anchor myself when the wind outside threatened to scatter my thoughts. And then came the dream. It started as a whisper in the night. A dream so vivid that I woke drenched in sweat, the trailer quiet except for the faint creak of the walls settling. Lila appeared, but not as the woman I had loved or hated. She was distant, like a painting I could see but not touch, her eyes hollow in a way that reflected my own emptiness. She reached out and I ran. The dream ended with the sound of shattering glass, and when I awoke, the sunlight was pale and cold, a reminder that reality had its own rules. I didn't dwell on it, but the imagery clung, lingering at the edge of consciousness, urging me to examine what I had been avoiding. Spring arrived with a subtle insistence. The snow melted into rivulets, the trees budded with cautious green, and the air began to carry the scent of damp earth and new growth. I spent long hours walking the ridges, the physical exertion a kind of meditation. My body began to remember strength, not merely endurance. I found a rhythm between work and reflection, between solitude and the occasional human contact with Mara or the neighbors. Life, stripped of pretense, began to feel authentic. It was during one of these spring walks that I encountered a man named Jonathan. He was a local photographer, interested in capturing the subtle beauty of the hills in spring light. He had an easy way about him, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but held it nonetheless. We struck up a conversation about composition, the play of light and shadow, and I found myself thinking more about framing moments in life as one might frame a photograph, with patience, care, and an eye for detail. Jonathan became a regular presence, accompanying me on early morning treks, pointing out hidden vistas and rare birds. His friendship was uncomplicated, free from the emotional baggage that had followed me from the city. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, I received a message that made the blood drain from my face. It was from Leela. She wanted to meet. She was in town for a conference and needed closure. I stared at the phone, the words burning into my mind. Part of me wanted to run back, to feel that familiar warmth, to hear apologies that might soothe the scar tissue. But another part of me, the part that had survived the trailer, the snow, the isolation, recognized the trap. Closure, she said, as if closure could be delivered like a parcel. I typed back a simple, deliberate response. I'm not ready, maybe never. Her insistence did not waver. Texts came daily, alternating between apologies, confessions, and hints that she was alone now, that Rowan had vanished, and that she had realized she had thrown away something good. Each message chipped at me in its own way, stirring memories and emotions I thought I had buried. I could feel the tension coil inside, a mixture of longing and revulsion. It was a test of my own boundaries, a confrontation with the remnants of my old self. Through it all, Mara remained a steady presence. She offered advice without judgment, listening to my doubts and fears with patience. She reminded me that healing is not linear, that trust is rebuilt only through consistent action and integrity. Our conversations deepened further, touching on our personal philosophies, past mistakes, and the kind of love we believed in. There was a gentle intimacy forming between us, a connection built on honesty rather than passion or shared history. It was a new kind of bond, fragile yet promising. Summer brought with it unexpected challenges. A sudden storm knocked out the power for days, forcing me to confront the vulnerabilities of isolation. I had to repair a section of the trailer's roof, navigate muddy terrain to fetch water, and rely on Jonathan and a few neighbors for help. The experience was exhausting but empowering, a tangible demonstration of my capacity to endure and adapt. It reminded me that strength is not always about confrontation. Sometimes it is about persistence, patience, and resilience. It was during one of these stormy evenings that I received a call from Ray. He wanted to check in, make sure I was holding up. Hearing his voice reminded me of the kindness he had shown, the initial lifeline that had brought me to the hills. We spoke long into the night about trivial matters and serious ones alike. By the end of the conversation, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the people who had quietly helped me navigate the aftermath of betrayal. In the midst of these months, I began to notice subtle shifts in myself. The anger that had once defined my waking hours became less frequent, replaced by a cautious optimism. I allowed myself moments of joy, laughing at a clumsy fox, marveling at a rare bird in flight, savoring the taste of freshly baked bread. These moments were small, almost imperceptible, but they were signs of a mind and heart gradually rebuilding their capacity for happiness. Mara eventually visited the trailer. Our first meeting in person was tentative. We sat on the porch with mugs of tea, watching the sun dip behind the hills. There was a quiet understanding between us, a recognition of shared experiences and mutual respect. Conversation flowed naturally, sometimes laced with humor, sometimes with reflection. By the end of her visit, I realized that the bond we had cultivated through calls had taken root in reality. There was no rush, no pressure, only the gradual unfolding of trust and companionship. One evening, as we watched fireflies dot the edge of the field, Mara spoke softly about forgiveness, not of Lila, not of Rowan, but of ourselves. Holding on to anger, she said, is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. Her words resonated deeply. I thought about the trailer, the trails, the nights of quiet reflection, and understood that moving forward required a conscious decision to release the past, not erase it. It required the courage to embrace vulnerability again, to open oneself to love and connection without guarantees. I also began to understand the complexity of human desire. Love is not a static commodity. It ebbs and flows, sometimes betraying us, sometimes uplifting us. Lila had made choices that hurt deeply, but those choices did not define my future. My actions, my responses, my willingness to rebuild, these were the elements within my control. The hills, the trailer, Mara, Jonathan, the friends who had quietly offered their presence, they were not replacements for the past, but foundations for the future. The days became a tapestry of small victories and insights. I learned to garden, cultivating herbs and vegetables in the patch beside the trailer. I hiked further than before, mapping trails and discovering hidden springs. I wrote letters to no one, capturing fleeting thoughts, dreams, and fears. I began to understand that resilience is built not in grand gestures but in the accumulation of small, deliberate acts that affirm life's value. Evenings often ended with Mara and me sitting in silence, sharing the comfort of presence without the need for words. There was intimacy in that silence, a recognition that connection is as much about listening and being present as it is about speech or touch. Slowly, I found myself imagining a future where trust, love, and friendship coexisted, shaped not by betrayal but by deliberate choice. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the hills in shades of amber, gold, and crimson. The mornings were crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp soil, and the sun cast long shadows that danced across the uneven ground. I found myself reflecting on the past year, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the slow and deliberate healing, and realizing that I had changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. The pain had left its mark, yes, but it had also clarified what mattered and what I could no longer tolerate. I had learned to recognize my own worth, my capacity to forgive without condoning, and the importance of choosing who I let into my life carefully. Lila's messages had stopped weeks ago. She had attempted to reach me one final time, leaving a message that wavered between apology and regret, but I didn't respond. There was no anger left, just a steady, quiet acknowledgement that some doors close not because we slam them, but because we step away gracefully. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had feared lost forever. Mara's visits became more frequent, each one deepening the bond we had cultivated from afar. We shared dinners, walks along the ridge, and quiet evenings by the fire. There was a natural rhythm to our companionship, a sense of balance I hadn't experienced with anyone before. I realized that love, when stripped of desperation and neediness, was not about intensity but consistency, not about possession but presence. Mara embodied that, a constant without pressure, a choice freely made day after day. Jonathan continued to be a friend and guide, showing me how to see the landscape with a photographer's eye, but also teaching me to see myself reflected in the world. He encouraged me to take pictures of the hills, the stars, and even mundane moments like dew clinging to leaves at dawn. Through the lens, I learned patience and attention, noticing the beauty and imperfection and the impermanence of all things. Photography became a meditative practice, another tool to navigate the residual shadows of my heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of purple and orange, Mara and I walked along a familiar trail. We had reached a small clearing overlooking a valley, the wind gently stirring our hair. She stopped, turned to me, and smiled softly. "It's amazing how much life can change in a year," she said. Her voice carried warmth, curiosity, and something I had been longing to feel again: hope. I nodded, feeling the weight of unspoken words. I never imagined I'd feel this steady. I thought I'd always be looking over my shoulder, haunted by the past. "You've healed," she replied simply. "Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely, and that makes space for what's next." Her words settled into me like sunlight warming frozen soil. It was the first time I allowed myself to believe that I could step fully into a future unshadowed by betrayal, unburdened by resentment. I realized that the narrative I had feared, a life defined by loss and regret, had been rewritten through endurance, reflection, and intentional choices. That night, back at the trailer, I wrote again in my notebook. I recounted every moment of the past year. The anger, the isolation, the quiet victories, and the relationships that had restored my faith in human connection. I wrote without fear, without self-censorship, and as I did, a sense of peace washed over me. The story I had lived was no longer one of victimhood, but of survival and self-discovery. As weeks turned to months, I settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and fulfilling. Mara became a constant companion, not through obligation but through shared choice. We celebrated small milestones together. The first harvest from my garden, a rare sunrise captured in a photograph, an impromptu night hike under a sky filled with stars. These moments, ordinary and extraordinary all at once, stitched together the fabric of a life rebuilt from its broken threads. I came to understand that betrayal had not defined me. My responses to it did. The fire that once threatened to consume me had tempered into something steady, illuminating my path rather than destroying it. Each step on the trail, each morning by the fire, each conversation with Mara or Jonathan had been a deliberate act of reclaiming agency. Life had taught me that happiness is neither guaranteed nor accidental. It is cultivated through resilience, reflection, and the courage to remain open to connection. And then, one crisp morning, a letter arrived. Not from Lila, not from anyone tied to the past, but from someone entirely new. An old friend I had lost touch with years ago. Someone who had seen glimpses of the person I was before everything fell apart. The letter was warm, filled with curiosity, care, and an unspoken invitation to reconnect. I realized that by allowing myself to heal, to honor my own boundaries, and to rebuild trust deliberately, I had opened the door not only to Mara and friendship, but to the possibility of new connections that were untainted by the past. I spent that day walking along the ridge, letting the wind whip through my hair and the sun warm my back. The hills were no longer intimidating, they were home, a canvas for my own growth. Each tree, each stone, each whisper of the wind carried a lesson about endurance, perspective, and the quiet strength of solitude. When Mara joined me that evening, we sat side by side in silence, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because the past had been erased, but because I had learned to carry it without letting it weigh me down. The hills, the isolation, the storms, all of it had forged a resilience I had once doubted existed. "You've changed," Mara said quietly. "You're lighter somehow." I smiled, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "I've learned to let go," I replied, "and in letting go, I found something I didn't know I was missing, myself." We watched the sky darken, stars emerging one by one, and I realized that life's narrative is never linear, never fully predictable. Betrayal and heartbreak had been chapters, not the conclusion. Healing, trust, connection, and resilience were the chapters I was writing now. Deliberately, thoughtfully, and with a steady hand. The trailer no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It felt like the center of it, a place where I had rebuilt, redefined, and reclaimed my life. I had learned that the scars of the past were not marks of weakness, but of survival, and that moving forward required courage, patience, and the willingness to remain open to love and connection again. And as I sat there with Mara, the wind carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and distant fires, I knew that I had finally arrived at a place where the past could rest peacefully, and the future stretched ahead, wide and inviting, waiting for the next chapter I would choose to write.